How's it going, guys? In this video I'll be showing you how to replace the turbo in your 2.0 liter turbo Hyundai or Kia. The first thing we need to do is to pop the hood to gain access to the engine. The next step, I recommend removing the engine cover. We can just grab on the corner and lift. And we'll set that aside. The turbo is connected to the exhaust manifold located on the back of the engine. It's hidden underneath these heat shields, so what we'll want to do is remove these in order to gain access. They are held on by a few 10mm screws. That's the top one. And the bottom one also has a few 10mm screws. I left one or two out of the bottom the last time I assembled this. So I'll just be removing this top one. We'll want to move this O2 sensor cable to the side. It's just pressed into place and held on by this heat shield. So you can see that if we just push up on this clasp, it slides out of place and it won't get in our way. We can then pull up and pull the heat shields completely out of the vehicle. Now we should have a lot more visibility and access to the exhaust manifold, turbo, and the wastegate. The next step would be to pull this elbow out of the way that connects the turbo to the intercooler. Kia used a different type of clasp, which I didn't like, so I just used some easier ones that I had laying around. Once this elbow is out of the way and we have better access to the wastegate itself, I recommend removing it. That way we can have better access to this hose, which connects to the side of the turbo. It's extremely difficult to get to if the wastegate is in the way, and it'll make things a lot easier when we're trying to remove the turbo as well as reinstall that air hose. The first step to disconnecting the wastegate is to remove this connector by pushing on the top here and pulling it out towards yourself. It might be a little difficult because dirt and debris may have gotten in there over the years and locked it in place. The next step would be to disconnect the arm on the back of the wastegate. The left side has a retaining clip on it, which you can pop out of place with a small flathead screwdriver and push in between the back side of the arm here and the clip itself. Once you push down hard enough, you should be able to make a gap, which will allow that clip to pop out. What I recommend is putting a cloth below here just so you don't lose it. The right side, however, has a nut on it, which also has a spring and a couple other small pieces. So if you were to take off the right side that's connected to the actual wastegate actuator, you risk losing a couple more pieces down in the engine. That's why I like to remove this left side. I'll put a small video clip up of me removing this from a different video. And that's where the rag comes in handy. Once the arm is disconnected, we can push it out of the way. And in order to remove the wastegate actuator itself, there are 3 bolts hidden back here on the back side of the turbo. Luckily, I have my old assembly here with the exhaust manifold turbo assembly, so we can see how this was all set up. Again, you can see here when removing the wastegate arm, there will be a small clip holding it in place right here for moving back and forth. Or you can choose to remove this 10mm nut. If you pop that out of place, again, there's a a small spring here and possibly a washer. So it all depends on your preference and ease of use. If you can't get this side off, you know, you might want to try this side. Once this clip is removed, you can see how the arm will slide out of place, giving us free access to the wastegate itself. And the 3 bolts I was talking about that were hidden on the back side of the turbo are right here. It's 3 10mm bolts. Once these bolts have been removed, the wastegate should be free to be removed from the vehicle. Once that wastegate is out of the way, we'll see that we have all this extra access to this bottom air line. Again, it's located right here and goes below the wastegate into the side of the turbo. You can loosen the hose clamp with a lot more room, slide that out of place, and then we should be left with something that looks like this. The next step would be to remove the 17mm bolt that is holding this oil feed line into the top of the turbo. We can see it and access it from the top up here. And be careful because you probably will have some oil left in that line and it may drip, so just be aware that you might have some oil running around here once that line is removed. As a reminder, once the bolt is disconnected, the other end is still connected to the block, so be sure that you don't damage it by trying to force it out of position or out of the way. The next step, there's actually this oil return line that is connected to the bottom of the turbo itself. It's not very flexible, however it does have this kink in the middle. So be careful if you do remove this that you don't get it bent out of place or damage it by any way. And this is actually connected to the bottom of the turbo assembly, like such. So you'll probably want to get underneath the car. I had better luck just climbing up on top of the engine and reaching around this turbo block in order to remove those 2 bolts. You'll want to make sure that they come out evenly. That way you're not trying to cock it at an angle and stripping out any of the threads of the turbo itself. However, again, just like the last line, remember that this end is connected to the block. So if this falls down or you push on it, the actual line is going to bend and it won't line up again with the turbo. This was probably the hardest thing I had to line up again when reinstalling the turbo assembly. Once both of these lines have been removed from the turbo assembly, all that's left and holding it onto the exhaust manifold is a clamshell type clasp, which holds this portion of the turbo onto the side of the exhaust manifold with 2 bolts. I'll post a photo here showing you an example as I lost the old one. I recommend removing both of the bolts that are holding the clasp together. That way you can remove everything in 2 separate pieces. It'll be a lot easier than trying to move it out of the way of the turbo. Once that clasp has been removed, you can remove the turbo assembly by sliding it out of place. And here you'll see the CHRA cartridge, which generally some of these fans on the inside or the outside could have chips, could be damaged, could be bent, that could be riding on the inside of the manifold. You could be hearing some grinding noises. And also on the inside of here, the clearances are very minimal, so you want to make sure that everything is quiet. There's no grinding, cuts, grooves, nicks, chips, anything like that. Assuming that you purchased a full turbo housing with a new CHRA cartridge like this one, we can just simply reverse the steps that got us to this point in the reinstallation process. 2 very important points I want to mention. The first being that there is a guide pin hole here on the side of the CHRA cartridge. This hole lines up with a guide pin on the side of the exhaust manifold here. So if you're trying to push the new turbo in place and it's not going in flush, or you're trying to put the clasp on but the clasp isn't lining up, it's sideways, you need to keep an eye on the little guide pin here. If yours fell out or were damaged, I would recommend replacing that. But just so you're aware, if you do see a gap like such and you're trying to force it in place, it's not, the tolerance isn't lining up along the turbo, it's because that guide pin has to be lined up. The next important point I want to mention is to pre-lubricate the new turbo assembly by pouring oil into the feed line up top here and manually spinning the CHRA cartridge to ensure that the unit itself is pre-lubricated. If you do not pre-lubricate this assembly, you'll be starting it dry and more than likely damaging the new CHRA cartridge, and you'll have to do this job all over again and replace that cartridge. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you could, please leave a like and subscribe.